Good morning and welcome to Grace St. Luke's Church in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm the Reverend Ollie Rencher, rector, and I'm glad to welcome everyone today as we celebrate the feast of Absalom Jones. Many are gathered here in Tresvant Hall, and for those of you who are joining us online, we are especially glad that you've taken the time to join us this morning, or maybe you will be watching this at a later time. Our speaker, Yejide Peters Pietersen, she and I go back to my days in New York City when I was the seminarian at Church of the Holy Trinity, and she was a layperson active in that parish and talked about possibly looking at ordination. And now fast forward, right? That was for me between 2000 and 2003, but she is now serving at Yale Divinity School, and of course she can introduce herself more, but I personally just wanted to acknowledge what a privilege it is to have Yejide with us here. Before we begin, I will offer the collect for the Feast of Absalom Jones. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Set us free, Heavenly Father, from every bond of prejudice and fear, that honoring the steadfast courage of your servant Absalom Jones, we may show forth in our lives the reconciling love and true freedom of the children of God, which you have given us in your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Amen. Please join me in welcoming Yejide Peters Pietersen.
Good morning. I'm only disappointed that it's COVID time. My mic on? Let me see. Is the mic on? Okay. Let's see. All right. I think my mic is on now. No. Okay. Is that better? All right. It's off. Okay. Is it on now? Yes. All right. So it's great to be here, and I'm only sorry that it's COVID time because I would just give Father Ollie a big hug. He is an amazing person. You're so blessed to have the clergy and staff that you have here. It says a lot about who you are. I see all the things you're doing in the world, and I feel like this is just one more part of a longer and deeper conversation you're already having as a city, as a congregation, and most of all, as followers of Jesus in this place. So I just want to begin by acknowledging that I am so excited to be here in Memphis. I went with Father Ollie. We went and we explored a little bit of the city, and I was even able to see a sort of copy of the original Green Onions album, and I took a picture and sent it to my siblings because we love Stax Records and we love jazz and we love good old R&B, and so it's just great to be here. And we all know that that wonderful history is very layered, as Father Ollie is fond of saying. It's very complicated, right? So there's the wonders and the beauty of this rich place, this rich Delta place, and there's also the horrors and the tragedy. And I think one of the things I love about Absalom Jones is that in his life, he reminds us that the challenges of how we have dealt with anti-Blackness, with racism in this country are not bounded by the Mason-Dixon line. In fact, the story of Absalom Jones is entirely a story that takes place in the Northeast. Born in Sussex, in Delaware, I would call humanly trafficked as an infant, so born into bondage. He and his mother and siblings are soon whisked away from that place when he's a young boy to live in Philadelphia, then the most prominent city in the United States. In fact, the place, as you know, where we had our conventions and a place of commerce and possibility, and also the largest population of African persons who were free in what had become the United States of America. And so, born in 1746, he is an incredible figure just without ever having become a priest, because he's obviously incredibly intelligent and also is a really good businessman. So he is still a bondservant, still enslaved, trafficked to someone else, and finds a way to get a second job where he keeps the money from that job and uses that money to purchase the freedom of the woman that he eventually marries. And then he tries to get this person to manumit him, and apparently he was a really good worker, so this person didn't want to do that, but was striking some deals with him. So he's still, enslaved to this horrible situation, this person. He buys land for himself and buys several tracts of land and puts up small houses. And all the while trying to get this person to convince this person to let him buy his own freedom. And eventually he's really concerned because as long as he's, under the sort of aegis of this person can come in and take his land from him. So ultimately he's able to buy his freedom and becomes a prosperous businessman, and also becomes, along with Richard Allen, a man with a similar story, become the two overseers, a very sort of United Methodist word for a bishop sort of person, for this new mission to the population of free African persons in Philadelphia. And they continue this Free Africa Society. It's kind of a non-denominational church club / worship service / alms sort of a support system. They decide and they vote at one point that they're going to become affiliated with the Protestant Episcopal Church. Now, heretofore, they've been mostly Methodists, right? And some other collections of other people. But they decide this is the way they want to go. And some people leave, and Absalom Jones stays. So does Richard Allen for a time. But over time, Allen really comes to believe that the methods, the Wesleyan methods, are the key to engagement with and evangelism of African persons. Now, I just want to remind you that this is a time in America where things are not as solidified as they become as we get closer to the sort of antebellum period. So you have a situation where people are bonded, people are indentured, people have more ambiguous sort of categories for how they're being treated as slave and freed, and people have been manumitted. So there are these large populations of people who are not enslaved. Especially in the Tidewater and in the American North. So we go forward and we see that, Richard Allen kind of figures out, like, listen, I want people to be educated and I want people to have certain opportunities, and the methods provide this way for that to happen. So as you may or may not know, quick history lesson, the Methodism, comes out of the Wesleyan tradition. John Wesley died an Anglican clergyman, but he felt this was the way to sort of reinvigorate the church. And so when the Methodists come to America, people who are following the Methodists who are England, they decide to they're waiting to get people to come and be overseers over here and have to go to England. And finally they just say, we're going to make our own church here. We're going to do our own thing. And it's that very intrepid spirit that inspires Richard Allen to start what becomes the second largest African-American denomination in the country, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is a sister to our own church. But in both the case of Absalom Jones and the church that he ultimately starts out of that Free Africa Society, which becomes St. Thomas Africa Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, in both cases, the ways in which those churches were treated by their parent bodies was unconscionable. So, for example, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, both very educated, self-educated, but educated, they're incredible men of means and persuasion. And so in the middle of this crisis that happens, there's this terrible yellow fever pandemic, and it basically consumes Philadelphia. The government, because the U.S. government is in Philadelphia, it moves, people leave, they flee, and there's this myth arises that people of African descent cannot die from yellow fever. Well, that's just not true. But anyway, that's the myth out there. And so they go and they compel these 2 men. They say, well, help us, Absalom Jones, help us. Get people to come help and be nurses and kind of move these bodies and do something, because we have no infrastructure right now. So Richard Allen and Absalom Jones go out and encourage people who are free Africans to go and help in this effort. Now, when all this is over, someone who himself lead, this wonderful hero of the story, a publisher, starts writing these screeds about how the Africans plundered people during the time of crisis. They stole from them. They price gouged them. It was terrible, And the incredible thing is Richard Allen and Absalom Jones write a defense of the African person. They said, we helped you when this was all happening. How dare you impute the good name of our people who put their lives on the line for our community? And they do that even though in his own sort of, in the conversation that's out there in the world, people are like, oh, Richard Allen and Absalom, they're above board, they're wonderful people. However, the common Black person is a person who is nefarious and awful and will use every opportunity to steal from you. What is admirable about Absalom Jones is you think about, here's a person who's at the height of society and life, well-liked by many, quite wealthy. He decides to put his own reputation on the line. Not for himself, but because it's morally wrong for people to be treated this way. I will not allow you to speak ill of people who have actually served and supported you. And he points out that any sort of change in prices had to do with the fact that people were outbidding each other. Like, I'll pay $5 for a nurse. No, I'll pay $10 because there were so few nurses because so many people had died and other people had left. So I bring this up to say the kind of moral character that these men have is part of the reason why, despite their differences about ecclesiology, they remain friends. And I would argue that they remain sort of images of two possibilities within the African-American religious experience. One being that you would try within the body that you feel called and led to, because let's not forget, Richard Allen would have preferred to have been a Methodist within a large Methodist community, as Alkmund would want it to be in sort of the Episcopal community. However, at a certain point, Richard Allen decided, this is not appropriate. I do not like how this is going. You will not allow my church to become its own church. I've started a church. He decides, you know what, I'm going to start my own denomination. And I'll be the very first bishop of this church. Now, to note, that's a page from their own book, because that's what the Methodists did too. They were waiting for a bishop to come. One never came and said, well, we know a guy. He's really smart, he's got a lot of converts. You are our next bishop. Anoint him now. They did a laying on of hands of other ministers. So he was taking it. This is the thing about when you make a change, you're not necessarily in charge of the next part of the narrative. Now, I want to sort of backtrack and say, Absalom Jones is, so I've just told you he wrote this incredible document, and it changed this man's mind. The man who's a publisher was kind of intimidated by this document, and over a 20-year period, changed his whole story about this, and it went from being evil Negroes to being, lots of people were struggling, and everyone was just trying to do what they could. And so, a total shift, right? So persuasive and well documented. When Absalom Jones decides that he feels called to be the priest of this new possible church that's coming into being, a church whose charter says that the only people who will be voting members of this new church will be people of African descent. Unless you think, well, how can that be? Remember that the entire body of law in the United States at that point is saying only white men can be charter members of things. So this is just sort of saying, well, that's fine. You be charter, I'm going to be charter members of my thing. And so he decides, I really feel called to be the minister of this. He is delayed in his possibility of being ordained by people saying he's undereducated. He's unable to express himself. He's barely literate. Now, it's not possible that someone could A, be barely literate, and B, write an incredible pamphlet that persuades a powerful person to change their opinion and their mind. Nor would I argue that in a situation where free Black persons could read and write in Philadelphia, he would not have been promoted to the place of being sort of in charge of things and be our liturgical leader were he unable to read and write. There would be plenty of other people who would be perfectly good candidates, and it wouldn't have been him. But nevertheless, it takes him ages and ages and ages and ages, and he finally is ordained to the diaconate. He's finally ordained to the priesthood about 5 years later. And then, after all this is said and done, he's like 55 when this all happens. The church goes on. It takes the church about 40 years to be recognized as a parish. The church is large, prosperous, Sunday schools, children, baptisms, everything. But there's always a reason why they can't quite make it into the annals of the convention. And finally, someone just calls it out for what it is and says, this is a person who's a white ally supporter. Says, this is outrageous. How there is no reason there should be a bar for these folks being part of our convention. And they are finally seated. So I give you this large, broad stroke thing to say that the story of the ways in which faith and witness and challenge are woven into the American religious understanding repeat themselves, sometimes in different keys, but in a similar pattern throughout the history of the United States of America. And I would also argue that the suppression of these truths is actually quite dangerous and unhealthy for us as Christian persons. particularly as Christian persons who are engaged in a particular denomination who has a complicated history with these things that goes to back to the very beginning. So in as much as we're unable and unwilling to acknowledge that and to work with that, we're unable to actually progress. And I suspect that some of the reasons why we are less attractive to younger persons than we might want to be is that sometimes they are very quick to see the lie. If you're a newly created church, you can make up a story about what you would have done then. But if you were there from the beginning, it's not a secret what you did. I wanted to sort of move into a place of thinking about how that resonates or doesn't with Memphis. So one might consider the fact that enslaved persons very often took on the denominational affiliation of the person who was human trafficking them, who was holding them against their will, because that was the person who's available to sort of sort things out. But one thing I want you to consider is when people were manumitted en masse at the end of the Civil War, or during the Civil War, that whole sort of process, people were originally, they were happy to continue worshiping the way they had been worshiping, but with some provisos. If I'm going to stay in this thing, I'm not going to stay as a 15th class citizen. Like, I'm happy to stay worshiping with you. I'm unhappy to be excluded from your worship. I'm unhappy to be continuing and persisting in a balcony. And also remember that during the Reconstruction era, Black people who had means and were literate found their way quickly into the halls of power and were quickly sort of elected to things and were involved. And so the idea that once involved, taking that sort of place in front, there's no way you're going to want to come in on Sunday and sit in the back. I know who I am. I know what I am, and I will not, especially in the house of God, be put in a sort of small place. At the same time, the narrative, and this is what I want to sort of draw your attention, I've attached this article from a professor who's currently teaching at Yale Divinity School, is actually our sort of premier theologian, Professor Willie Jennings, who's an American Baptist, not to be confused with National Baptist, so more like where we're coming from, sort of mainline tradition with a complicated history. He talks about the ways in which Christian theology in the Americas is precisely what gives rise to the possibility of the kind of understanding of race we have here. It's the notion of a particular group of persons who are especially anointed by God that allows one to position oneself in that space. And there's probably only one other place in the world that has quite a similar narrative. And I think South Africa has a similar narrative in terms of people feeling, I've arrived in a new Jerusalem, I've arrived in the new Zion, I will take hold of this land, and anyone who would stand in my way is in the way of God. That's the part about the land. But then also, by the power of God, I have been put at the pinnacle of humanity, and I am in a position to decide how and where we deal with other people. Even, I would say, to give them their life or not. And so that underpinning is still with us in all these complicated ways. And I want to bring that to us to say that yes, this is a Philadelphia story, but I would say that those underpinnings are still a part of how we unconsciously relate to the world as Americans. And I think especially as Americans who are in a mainline tradition, a part of sort of the majority understanding of what happens, that, water is wet. We're just swimming in it and we're just not even knowing what we're doing. So I want to free us from the idea that not knowing is a crime. You don't always know what you don't know. But I also want to say that sometimes we do know. So I'm going to end with this story. I read this wonderful book by Yejide Jones called The Silver Sparrow. Then the book, it begins, the first sort of sentence in the book is, my father is a bigamist. And the book is about two girls who grow up, and they're around the same age, and one knows that she is the daughter of the second family, and the other daughter does not know. And it's about the collision and the reality of what we know in our heart and we won't admit, and what we know because we have to live it. And so I look at that story as kind of an allegory of things, because what emerges, and this is without giving any plot away, what emerges is that in the other family, there have been many clues that things just don't add up. But the persisting mythology in the first family is that we have a wonderful family, and it's just lovely. And we have a wonderful life. And I won't question any of it. And it's all going to turn out okay. The other family, there's no such possibility, right? Because they all know we get the scraps of the day. I know that the girl knows my dad gives me the same gift he gives to the other daughter. Like, it's this whole complicated notion. But I said that to say, what we don't know, we don't know. But once we do know, I think we are accountable for our very survival to lean into that knowing and to begin to challenge things in ways that allow us to breathe, to really see things for what they really are, and to become who God has called us to be. I think being in bondage to lies means that we can't live in truth, right? We can't proclaim a gospel if we're living in lies. But sometimes we don't know. And sometimes knowing isn't for everyone. There are people for whom the knowing is too much. And we have to understand that that's where they are. But if you're here today and having this conversation or listening or watching online, you have a willingness to know and to engage and to think about it. And I think our challenge and our opportunity is to say we can know and we can persist in love and possibility. We can believe that, as Absalom Jones did, that God is standing before us and ahead of us in this journey and encouraging us to tell the truth about lynchings, to tell the truth about people being sold, about human trafficking, about enslavement, about money that was gotten in wrong ways, about things we never talk about all the things that are just really shameful and scary and hard, and know that in that we take it off and say that it's not who I am and I want to be free. I would rather take off this garment and be able to be who I really am than to continue to hold on to it and be really slowly suffocated by things that aren't true, that are hurtful, and are not who I want to be. So I want to invite you, because I think we're all on this journey. It's not that it's any easier or magic. My family is from the South. There's no magic to thinking about horrible, tragic, sad things. But there is freedom in not being silent. And as someone whose family is from the South, I can tell you that telling the truth about a hard thing is not a thing that my family is easily going to do. It's not a thing. But we can learn new ways of doing things, and it can still be gracious, and it can still be loving, and it still can be kind. But maybe there are new ways that we can be, new ways that give hope and possibility and honor God. So I'm going to open it up for I want to hear what we want to talk about. So I have to do it a little bit, but I want to hear what we want to talk about. One of the things I found interesting about his narrative is when I think about enslavement, and I did study, I was African American Studies major, so I did study enslavement as part of my curriculum. But I think we always forget how messy it was. And it wasn't like everything went the exact same way for every person in every moment, that there are human realities into that. And I think part of the reason why we do that is because making it seem like this one big system allows us to avoid the particular every single one of those stories. It's like when I read, 35 girls were humanly trafficked. It's heartbreaking to read each story, and each girl is different. And each thing, I think it's so much easier to just think 35 people got on a plane. That's really sad. I hope things work out. To think of each of those little girls and their family and what's happened there is soul crushing. So I want to encourage you and say, I think a church is a place where we can actually take that to the cross, literally, quite literally. And we can take that knowing that in that we're walking with Jesus in that work, that we're not walking alone, and we're not doing it alone, and we're together in it. And that makes all the difference. To me, it makes all the difference between sitting there and reading a newspaper and sort of opening my arms up and saying, what can I do to help? And that's what I see you do. And I see you moving toward action and engagement, and that inspires me.
We'll open it up for questions, and Jeff has a mic and I have a mic, and we'll come to you. Questions or observations or comments?
Thank you for sharing, for reflecting, and what it's making me think a little bit about is what I'm looking around and seeing that we're all drinking, or many of us are drinking coffee. Sometimes that's called the eighth sacrament, yes? I happen to think, even with that loveliness, that if we were to debate the number of sacraments, that the eighth sacrament might be discomfort. And your words and reflections and my time sitting here thinking some more make me think about that, especially with the opportunity to be in discomfort and to not run away from it, and then to see where, if we sit there, what stories come from that place and the healing and transformation that is possible if we're willing to go to those daring places. So it makes me think about that eighth sacrament in that way. It makes me think about some of the work that's going on in Sacred Ground and the conversations that we've been having there, the diocese is inviting more of, especially a lot of this white work to be done in knowing our history that oftentimes hasn't been shared, or as it's been shared, but somehow it is transmuted in a way where we don't talk about it. Something happens when we are able to sit into that place of discomfort and to see what healing and transformation and community can look like. So thank you for helping me think a little bit more.
Thank you for saying that. I think discomfort does not always hold this unholy discomfort, but I think the discomfort of something being said that we hadn't thought of before, or being challenged. I think about those disciples and the number of times that they really seem uncomfortable with what Jesus is doing. I mean, it's pretty much a daily occasion for them. I mean, I feel like they keep thinking, I'm getting it right. Okay, so we're gonna be in heaven and I'm gonna find my spot. And he's like, no, and they're just like, well, then if it's not that, what's gonna happen? Like, what are you saying? So I feel like maybe part of it is the way that we worship may unconsciously make us feel like it's not godly or holy to feel kind of prickly, but I kind of feel like that might be God waking us up sometimes, you know? I know in my own life that's happened. I've been like, oh, I feel uncomfortable. That's how I ended up here. Ollie told you I didn't want to be a priest, but now here I am. It's been pretty great. But I wonder about that holy uncomfortability. Like, is there a space in church for that?
Well, I actually was thinking of a different question before you
go
asked
for it.
that.
Yes, go for it.
So, you were talking about the discomfort in your own family about talking about our racial history and our and enslavement and human trafficking and all of that. And, you know, I was just very interested in that because I think certainly within my own family, we are uncomfortable in talking about that in my extended family, and so I was very interested to hear a little bit more about how that goes in your family, because I have a feeling it's a different kind of discomfort, but maybe it's the same. You tell me.
I think it's not, in my family, thank you for the question, I think in my family it's not a discomfort talking about the realities of enslavement, but the particularities of losses that are absolutely racial, the trauma of losses that were, I mean, okay, so you have these big stories about like the migration, right? Like the Great Migration. Well, I would say, was it great? I don't know. But I can tell you that in the case of my family, at least on my one side of my family, it definitely was trauma-induced. So in the midst of all these upheavals you hear, like, you know, in South Carolina, they were burning down courthouses, and then you can't have a deed because the courthouse has been burned down. And then I say, well, that's not really your land. That's actually my land. And there's no way to prove it. These are things that impacted my family. The realities of the precariousness of landowning African Americans and mixed race people in the Tidewater and in this part of the country and in the West are well documented, but my family lived those things. And so the complicated realities of that kind of thing, retelling those things for the people who lived it are too terrible to say. And so basically you know that they happen, but I think it's almost impossible to access that on a regular basis and be whole. And so I think that that's a part of it. And I think that you write that 1,000 times over. For my family's been here since the 1600s. So hundreds and hundreds of times over, there are many things that are just too terrible to speak. And so it doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore those things, and my family is doing that now. But I think understanding that those people who survived those things, their way of surviving was also, like many people have been traumatized, to say, I go forward. I understand what happened, but I do not wish to revisit that and labor on that. I must live my life. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes.
And I think, I wonder what's the discomfort. I wonder, speaking to sort of going back to you, what do you think the discomfort is in your family? Where do you think that might come from? What that might look like?
Guilt.
Guilt.
Yeah, just guilt, I think, and not wanting to see that. Yeah, because on both sides of my family, people were slaveholders, and so that is, and that's, something that there's some real guilt around, and so it's very hard to look at and to revisit, and there's a sense of, oh no, maybe we don't need to talk. Why do we want to talk about that now? That we were those people, but still, I mean, it's the same story you hear from white people all over. So it's hard. It's hard conversations to have. What do you do for reparations? How do you even begin to think about that? That would be a really hard conversation.
But necessary, probably. Very true. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think that it's also that it didn't stop with enslavement, right? So there's all these other engagements between white and black persons in America after enslavement, after Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, and all those things. And I think that it's a collective denial that that is supported because the other thing is very hard, but also maybe because it shakes at the very core of things. I don't think it's a peripheral issue. I would say that race and the construction of race is at the heart of the American project, and the heart of how Americans understand each other, which is why, for example, people who are in certain white ethnic groups that became white, like there's actually a moment where certain groups become white in like the late 60s here in America, they have a hard time remembering, if they lived through it, what it was like before. You have to kind of say, remember? And they're like, oh, yes. But it's very painful because once you come into whiteness, you must also divest yourself of things that would remind you that it exists. So it's really tricky to talk about race because we focus on black people, but I think whiteness is a place to think about the construction of whiteness, and the silence around that is how things like lynching and collective violence happen and people cannot remember. And I'm always struck, like someone said, all the people who were in Little Rock who threw stones at children and yelled at them and called up signs, like no one is saying that was them, but obviously it was someone's grandmother, it was someone's person, like a whole lot of someone's, right? So how do we open up the dialogue, so not for shame, but for acknowledgement and engagement? Does that make sense? Because I don't know if shame is going to help us get where we need to go.
Good morning. My name is Tom Momberg, and I'm the vicar of Holy Trinity Episcopal Church, and I have several of my good folks here with. Would you raise your hands so that the folks who come here know who you are? We are having church here today because you are here, and because Grace St. Luke's continues to be a model for our diocese in terms of the work that needs to be done around racial healing. I want to suggest that for me, it is not about guilt, it is about shame. And the distinction between those two, guilt being I did a wrong thing, shame being I am a bad person. The way I have come to my awareness includes the reality that I left Memphis in 1966 to run to New England for college because of the racist place that I experienced this to be. Only to discover when I was 60 years old and a priest that I was in a diocese whose new bishop, the first African-American bishop in that diocese, I was in a diocese where I was going to learn more about the place where I had gone to college. Because the Sacred Ground folks, before they became Sacred Ground, came to a diocesan convention and told their story about going back and doing their work, their family work. And I realized at the age of 60 that God's infinite sense of humor was to make me think I had run away from racism at the age of 17, only to come to awareness later that I was running away from my own racism.
Yes.
And I am grateful to the Episcopal Church and all the people who have been in my path who have helped me get comfortable with being uncomfortable and continuing to realize that as a white male priest, my privilege always goes before me.
That's really helpful, and I like that, the way that you're making that distinction about the sort of what's going on in the inner self. And I think that, I think it is shame that prevents us from coming forward and dealing with things. And also I feel like the reason why we can't have some of these conversations is the issue of guilt hasn't been resolved. You know, you think about other processes that we've encouraged people to have, like the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa, or the ways in which we deal with war criminals or people who do terrible things. They have, you know, crimes against humanity. We've never had that conversation in the U.S., and I think one of the reasons why we also get in a pickle is we're always bringing that sort of standard to other people, and then it's like, it's absurd. Like, literally, you guys are completely built on this entire thing we're doing. It's like that. It's a bit mad. It's like, do you not see that you're like indicting yourself? Like, you won't have this conversation, and you want everyone else to kind of get on board. Like, whoa, that's pretty tough to manage. And I think part of that, managing those two structures, we want justice in the world, we want people to be treated with dignity and respect. We will not acknowledge, or we seldom acknowledge, we're very uncomfortable dealing with the structural ways the entire setup of the U.S., the lands, the human labor, the continuing patterns are not living into what we say we believe. And that I think is actually really condemning, but also creates a greater sort of shame pit that it's harder to get out of, because you're invested now in keeping that sort of not together, right? Not holding two, you know, opposite thoughts in your mind at the same time. It's really, really hard. But perhaps there is a place for the kind of acknowledgement that there is something very shameful and saddening when we realize that we are loved by, and we ourselves are people who are participating in things, whether it was unwittingly or not, about which we feel no pride at all. And that the getting out of that will be very difficult. But I commend the Sacred Ground work. Sounds like good stuff.
On that note, do you have any stories of like progress or inspiration that you can share in your personal life? That I think we all maybe are feeling that shame, but where's something to kind of, I struggle with like what to grasp onto, like where can I focus my energy to make some progress?
Thank you so much for that. I think that one of the things to acknowledge is that there always have been these wonderful people doing work that's usually unseen and unsung. I feel like first I want to acknowledge that your parish itself is doing work and is inviting you to do work that I think is really important. And that work has to do with being a person who is white identified and looking at how can I talk with other white identified people about, not about like, what do we make of all this? What are our stories? How can I do that work? And so I think as a Black woman, I'm not sure I can respond to all of that, but what I can say is that I see in history and even in present moments people who are doing that. So for example, the story I've told you about Absalom Jones, in both cases, both his ordination and also the inclusion of St. Thomas Episcopal Church, there were white allies who said this is morally wrong. I think this is fundamentally against who we say we are. And so there have always been persons who could clearly see, though it would be to their detriment, that they must stand up for what is good and what is just and what is right. And that's, I think, a stance that you take after many years of working on your stuff. They might not have had sacred ground, but something in them said, well, I'm just no longer willing to be, I can't be me, really be me and follow Jesus and do this thing. Even if it costs me friendships, I'm sure it did for that person. It always does when we divest ourselves of power. But I think we're blessed in a sense that we live in an age and a time in which we have all these resources and possibilities people didn't have back then. So I guess for me, the stories of hope are, I see students in seminary working with this stuff. I see churches like yours that are engaged. I've worked at churches and been a part of churches where people started really asking those questions, and the wonderful things that happen out of that. People are so afraid if we talk about it, we'll explode. The reverse is true. If we talk about it, there's joy available. There's friendships and relationships that are authentic. There's real possibility of engagement. When you're no longer trapped in fear, you actually get a lot of joy. So I would encourage anyone who hasn't done Sacred Ground to consider doing it really seriously, because the people I know who've done it, who are white identified, have really, really deeply been transformed by it and have loved it. And I see the fruits of that work and how they're engaging in their lives, in their ministries, wherever that might be. Does that make sense? The way they're looking at things is freer, it's clearer, and they feel more centered in something different. Does that make sense?
So, Yejide, thank you. Friends, join me in giving thanks for Yejide. And I would just like to take a point of personal privilege of gratitude, and to say that I too feel glad to be in a parish that is doing this work, that is doing the work individually and collectively. As it relates to race, it is the most complicated part of our story as human beings. Whomever we are in the country, in the world, it's the hardest work we'll do. And so I just commend that we worship and pray, and we believe that the reconciliation comes through the faith that binds us, but it is our hardest work. And I don't find that discouraging. I actually get excited if that work is taking place and that we are being courageous. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all. And thank you for those of you who joined us online. Peace.